In this week's YouTube Art School episode, I'll show you my full rendering process from start to finish. Everything I do from planning the sketch, choosing my colors, the shading, shadows, and the material highlights, but also what brush I use as a professional artist. This whole process is going to work exactly the same way whether you're using Photoshop like I am or Clip Studio Paint. So equip your smudge guard, grab your pen, and let's get started. I'm Marc, and nowadays I run a digital art school, but if you've been subscribed to the channel for a while, you've likely seen me show a variety of styles and methods already. From cell shading like this, to drawing in grayscale and then coloring with gradient maps. And while none of these are better than the other, today I'll show you another way, which happens to be my all-time favorite. It's quick and it's straightforward, another method to add to your arsenal, and maybe you'll prefer it over the others. Here's what we'll be doing. I'll give you just a brief rundown of the 5 steps we'll be using. You'll see it's super simple. Step 1 is to start with the sketch. This is where the planning for the composition will happen, but in this case, it's just a ball. For step 2, we'll add the flat colors. That's it. Step 3 is the most fun. You'll see why later, because this is just a boring sphere, but we'll be adding the shadows. Let's just imagine a light source coming from above. In step 4, we'll shade this ball very lightly to give it some depth, taking into consideration the same light direction we used in the previous step. And then in step 5, we'll add some material highlights from very shiny to less shiny as a finishing touch. So now, let's get serious. The hardest part will often be to come up with a cool idea to draw. But that gets exponentially easier when you work on a project like I am here, or if you have an original character that you're already familiar with. Having this initial direction will let your ideas materialize a lot faster instead of starting from nothing. I did the sketch of the character from my project a couple of days ago, but it felt too static. So for this new one, the goal was to make it into a more dynamic illustration. Close-up shots always feel more dynamic because we imagine ourselves behind the camera, like in close proximity to the character. So I'm sketching her overflowing from the canvas, trying to give her as fluid of a pose as possible. I almost always use my legendary line art brush for this step because of how traditional it looks. I love it. It's one you'll find in my starter brush set, but this step is meant to be quite rough because the line art won't make it until the end. It's just there initially as a guideline. No need to clean up the lines. With a new layer directly underneath, and by the way, my lines will remain on top of my layer stack until I get rid of them later. So the first new layer we'll create will be for the flat colors. This is a really quick second step where I'll block in my colors using another brush from my starter set, a full opacity hard brush. Obviously, the challenge this time will be to pick colors that work well together, and lucky for you, I recently made a class going over exactly how I do that, so I'll link it down below for you to check out later if needed. But here I'll just reuse very similar colors to a previous illustration of my character that I did some weeks ago. It's technically a split complementary color harmony with red, green, and blue, but the red is overwhelming here. I only have blue and green as some tiny accent colors, like those small gems she's wearing. It's really when she's against a blue sky that she pops, because then we get a very obvious cool color in the background to help contrast her warm tones. And to make my life easier later, I'll just make sure to separate each of the main colors into their own layer. This way I'll be able to just control click them and use them as selection instead of having to lasso tool, every single time. And you can see I'm adding some shadows already, but it's just the most obvious stuff like the folds, otherwise it's kind of hard to understand what's going on without. It's just there for clarity, and like you see, it's just 2 basic tones, only in some parts when it's really needed. Otherwise, like I said, it's a very quick step. So let's move on to the shadows, the most satisfying step of the process. So over my flats layer, I'll create a new multiply layer this time, but I'll set it as a clipping mask affecting all my flats. So since I have a bunch of them, I need to group them. The clipping mask is now affecting the whole group, and in Photoshop, you just gotta click here with the correct layer selected and it'll turn it into a clipping mask. You can tell with the little arrow there. In Clip Studio Paint, it's similar, but the option will be here instead, and you'll be able to tell it's a clipping mask because it'll turn red. And still using the same hard brush from the previous step, I'll grab a blue color and try guiding the eye of the viewer by adding more shadows away from the head of my character. I'm obviously imagining that she's outside, lit by the sunlight, and by leaving her face in the light, we're actually naturally drawn to it. So that's the logic. And an alternative way to paint this layer could be to just cover the whole thing in blue and then erase where you want the light to be. whatever you prefer. And I love this step because it gives us a really good preview of what the final illustration might look like. And it's so quick to do that you can very quickly try a bunch of different things before, settling on what you feel works the best. And one thing I always recommend to my students, if you find it challenging to place the shadows properly, it's to use the Magic Poser web app and recreate your pose and lighting real quick and use that as the reference. With some practice, you'll be able to do it without, but initially this is super helpful. And with some cleaning up done, my character is ready for some shading. At this point, before we start shading, I'll temporarily hide my shadow layer because we don't need it. I've already figured out where my light is coming from, and I wouldn't be able to color pick properly with that layer affecting all of my colors. So let's get it out of the way. The goal here will just be to go color by color and lightly shade things like we did with the sphere earlier. To make sure I can keep using my flat colors as selection, I'll be applying my shading on a new layer directly on top of whatever I'm shading. Just a regular layer, normal blend mode. For most of my colors, I'll just color pick them, darken them, saturate them a bit more, and tint them slightly towards their opposite warmth to get a richer palette. So, for example, if it's a warm color, I'll tint it more towards a cool color, saturate it a little bit, and darken it a little bit. And vice versa, if it's a cool color instead. And I'll do that as opposed to just adding black to every color because it will look a lot less muddy that way. This shading step is a bit tedious, but having good organization in your layers is really going to pay off here. It'll save you a ton of time. And as my shading progresses, I'll typically just completely get rid of my sketch because this will replace it. I use this shading step to really solidify my drawing and clean up anything that might have been left kind of rough or sketchy from the previous steps. And before I enable the shadows again and finalize my rendering, if you're looking for the best possible shortcut to learn all the skills necessary to paint something like this, a step-by-step program covering every topic you could possibly need to get to a pro level, or just really an overpowered hobbyist artist, check out my art school program and learn all about it with the link in the video description. The summer sale is still going for a little while longer, but as I tend to do, every discount gets smaller than the previous one, so take advantage of this huge discount we currently have on the full program. You get lifetime access, private access to our school discords, and a week-by-week study guide to guide you through all of the content so you always know exactly what to be working on next. Have a look down below to know exactly when the sale ends and find out why nearly 29,000 other students have joined. Now, let's take things up a notch. She's looking pretty good, but we're not done. Let's bring back the shadows, and on a new layer on top of everything else, just a regular layer, we'll get to work defining the materials we have here because so far, everything feels like it's made up of the same thing. Illustrations look much better when there's different types of contrasts, like contrast in the colors and the lights, and also in the materials. Basically what I'm doing here is I'm going over everything and adding highlights and reflections depending on what material I'm painting. Skin should have a little bit of gloss, but not too much. Metals should be very reflective, etc. I also take this time to clean up anything I might have left behind, which is why I called my layer fixes, and I'm adding more details whenever needed. Stuff like brush strokes to make this feel less digital, some subtle variations in the colors, very minor, but I think it helps. And the main brush I'm using for this step is this render brush that I have in my advanced brush set. I just like the subtle color variation that it introduces with each stroke. And by the way, I have links to my brush sets in the video description as well. Now, I wasn't going to add much of a background because I kind of like the empty blue back there, but I drew a few rocks and slapped that in there last minute and kind of decided to add some magic coming out of her monster hand, which as a result required me some light reflections to make it more believable. And with a little bit of noise added on top of everything, here's the final image. What do you guys think? Did the process help? I want to know your opinion down in the comments. And while you wait for next week's class, for a much different kind of drawing process video, I would really recommend checking out my cell shading video that should be up on screen in just a second. I'll see you there.